Good morning, ladies. Today we're going to talk about someone you might not have heard much about, at least not in preaching or teaching. His name is Jehoshaphat, or Jehoshaphat. You can pronounce it any way you want, but he's the same guy. You might have been familiar with the phrase jumping Jehoshaphat, but that's probably all you've heard about the man. Why was he called Jumping Jehoshaphat? Well, he really wasn't. That's just a phrase that was invented probably in the 18th century in England or America as a mild curse word. Sort of like saying darn or gosh. Jumping Jehoshaphat was the alternative to saying a swear word. It's kind of has alliteration, but I don't know. I don't think it's going to come back into use. But Jehoshaphat is really a fascinating guy. He's a lot like you and I. He's a man who, when he serves the Lord, he's fabulous. But when he drifts away from God, he leads his nation to the brink of ruin. He was an amazing person. He's arguably one of Judah's finest rulers. When he's good, he's very, very good. He turned his attention to educating the people of God. He's known as a great teacher, and some actually say he's the teacher king of Judah. Not a bad reputation to have. But on the other hand, Jehoshaphat did more to bring the nation to the very edge of catastrophe. His life falls into two distinct phases. In 2 Chronicles 17, we read about how he ascended and he rose, and then he lives up to his name, which means Yahweh has judged and has richly blessed. Because of Jehoshaphat's faithful actions, God blesses him and his people who are led into peace. But then in 2 Chronicles 18, we have a very different story. We have the decline of Jehoshaphat, where the intentions of God were abandoned and Jehoshaphat went his own way. And we almost saw the promise that God made to preserve the line of David collapse just because of Jehoshaphat's disobedience. But God pulled through. The lessons we can learn from this king in Judah are important to us. They certainly speak to me. Now, Jehoshaphat had seen the life of his father Asa and the mistakes and mess that he made, and he determined in his youth not to go the same way. In 2 Chronicles 17:1, we read that Jehoshaphat strengthened himself against Israel. Now remember, Israel is the northern kingdom, which was going into apostasy, abandoning God and worshiping the Baals. And Jehoshaphat strengthened himself against Israel. The word against is a Hebrew word that can mean above or ascended or over. It comes from the root word Allah, which means to ascend. So from the outset, Jehoshaphat had determined to rise above the ways of Israel and to rise above the ways of his father. He was going to be a faithful king. So the Lord was, as we read in 2 Chronicles 17, the Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he walked in the ways of his ancestor David. He did not seek the Baals. He did not follow after other gods, but he stayed faithful to God even as David had done. Well, why didn't he seek after other gods? Well, not only was Jehoshaphat trying to do better than his father Asa, but he was trying to do better than the king who lived just north of him in the northern kingdom of Israel. Ahab was that king. Remember him? He's the one the Bible says was the worst of all the kings of Israel. He'd been on the throne for 3 years when Jehoshaphat became king. And he had married a foreigner, Jezebel, who along with Ahab had introduced or fostered the worship of the Baals, many gods and goddesses too, in the northern kingdom. And this was absolutely against the will of God. Jehoshaphat knew what was going on in the northern kingdom. There were no secrets. He knew what Ahab was doing. And verse 3 in 2 Chronicles 17 tells us that his rule was blessed because he was doing the opposite of what Ahab and Jezebel were doing. He was walking, as they say, according to the commandments and not according to the practices of Israel. He was a distinct contrast to the king in the northern part of the kingdom, to the king of Israel. And because Jehoshaphat was rising above Israel, we read, the Lord established the kingdom in his hand, and all of Judah brought tribute to Jehoshaphat, and he had great riches and honor. That's in 2 Chronicles 17, verse 5. So he prospered, and the people prospered under him. And they recognized the king that they had, the good king, and they brought gifts and tribute to him. In verse 6, we read his heart was devoted to the ways of the Lord. And furthermore, he took the high places in the Asherim, or the Ashereth poles, out of Judah. He eliminated the places where other gods were worshipped. When we read that his heart was devoted, we could also translate the Hebrew word used to read that his heart soared or was lofty. His ideals were lofty. Again, ascending, lofty, high ideals. We have this image of things just getting better and better and better for Judah under the king Jehoshaphat. He started out so well. Jehoshaphat also began a campaign of education through Judah. In the 3rd year of his reign, he sent his officials to teach throughout all of Judah. He sent Levites, he sent priests, and he sent the law, copies of the law, to all the villages, to all the cities in Judah. And he had the people had the people learn from the law. The priests and the Levites were to teach them. He spread the wisdom of God. Why did he think this was important? Well, if the people knew God's laws and they knew the loving and merciful God behind them, they could avoid falling into the trap of looking for or worshiping others. They could avoid the evils of the cultures that surrounded and even permeated their nation. Jehoshaphat understood from the early part of his life that teaching God's ways was important. While Ahab and Jezebel were teaching people to worship the Baals, to commit sexual immorality, to even sacrifice children, Jehoshaphat was teaching his people that God's mercy and truth would separate them from the nations around them. He made sure the law of God was taught everywhere. And we read in 2 Chronicles 17 that the fear of the Lord fell upon the kingdoms around him, and they made no war against Jehoshaphat. God even blessed them with peace as they sought him. And Jehoshaphat's power and reputation grew. In addition to building fortresses and supply depots, he raised an amazing army of over 1 million men in Jerusalem alone. It was truly amazing what he did. He consolidated power. All of his successes were just building one upon another. He was soaring above Israel. He was guiding the nation of Judah steadily toward God. It would be great if we could end there, but we can't. Because, well, what happened? Look at the 18th chapter of 2 Chronicles. What a contrast. After some years, Jehoshaphat went down to Ahab in Samaria, and Ahab killed an abundance of sheep and oxen for him and for the people who were with him, and induced him to go up against Ramoth Gilead. Whoa, do you see the change in direction? Up until this point, the scriptures talk about the ascendancy of Jehoshaphat. He rises towards God. It brings his nation up. But now he goes down. He goes down to the capital, Samaria, the capital of Israel, and he visits the evil king Ahab. Why would he do that when he's trying to be so different from Ahab? Why would he visit Ahab and, in fact, make alliances with him? Well, at this point, Jehoshaphat had built a successful kingdom with great riches and the approval of the people. And he may have become overly self-confident instead of being God-confident. He did not think that his alliance with God was quite as important. He was not quite so desperate for God's help. He thought he could do things on his own. So despite the well-known rejection of God by the prophets and the leaders, the king and his wife in the northern kingdom, he goes there to meet with him. Instead of strengthening himself against Israel, as he did earlier, he opens himself up to Israel. Did he think that his wealth and his approval and his power and his status could protect him against the temptations of Ahab and Jezebel? Did he think that he could turn them against apostasy, do something that even God had not done and certainly had not called him to do? We're not clear. But he did do something that's amazing. Jehoshaphat formed a marital alliance. It was a very strong diplomatic move. He married his son to the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. This is incredible. His oldest son, Jehoram, the future heir to the throne of Judah, is married off to Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. You can't get a tighter alliance than this. Jehoram meant exalted by Jehovah or exalted by the Lord. Athaliah, his wife, means the one who God afflicts. What a contrast between the two names. What a contrast between the 17th and the 18th chapters of 2 Chronicles. First, a raising up, and now a descending, a bringing down. These true royal children joined in marriage, allied the kingdoms of Ahab and Jezebel with the kingdom of Jehoshaphat. And this is a radical departure from Jehoshaphat's policy earlier of raising himself in the kingdom above Israel and raising them to God. He's now given his son, in essence, his kingdom to an alliance with the very evil that he previously sought to surmount. Then next, Ahab kills sheep and oxen for all the people that Jehoshaphat brought with him, for his retinue that he had taken with him. Ahab doesn't make offerings to God. Ahab doesn't make offerings to the Lord. He doesn't worship the Lord. He doesn't even make offerings to the Baals or other gods. But he makes an offering to or for Jehoshaphat, stroking his ego and winning his agreement, Jehoshaphat's agreement to join Ahab in a military exercise to regain territory. What he did in the Hebrew is he incited Jehoshaphat to join him. If we look back in 1 Kings 21, we have the story of the death of Naboth. Do you remember the man who owned the vineyard that was coveted, that Ahab wanted? And Ahab's wife, Jezebel, worked out a plot to kill the man who owned the vineyard so that her husband could take it over. In that plot, the word used to describe how Jezebel convinced her husband to go along with the evil plot was the same Hebrew word which we translate as incite. This word is used 18 times in the Old Testament, always with the idea of persuasion or enticement to disobey God. And the word comes from the root for briars and thorns, and it means to prick someone or goad someone along to do evil. So you have Ahab, who is incited to evil by his wife, Jezebel. The same word in 2 Chronicles 18:2 is used to say how Jehoshaphat and was incited by Ahab, having just been showered with an abundance of sacrifices in his name. He is incited to join a military alliance. The Ahab, the king of Israel, said to Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, "Will you go with me to Ramoth Gilead?" And Jehoshaphat answered him, "I am as you are, my people as your people." Well, that's not true. "We will be with you in this war." But was this a battle God had asked Jehoshaphat to fight? Was this an alliance God had asked Jehoshaphat to make? No. Up until this point, there was no consulting of God. And Jehoshaphat seems to realize that. He says, well, maybe we should inquire for the word of the Lord in 2 Chronicles 18:4. But here we have a problem because Ahab does not inquire of the Lord. He inquires of the Baals. And he brings, in fact, this amazing scene, he brings all of his Baal worshiping prophets to prophesy to him and tell him what they should do. 400 prophets are come forward to advise the king, but they're all prophets of a false god. And even Jehoshaphat realizes that. He says, is there not a prophet of the Lord that we can consult? Well, Ahab doesn't exactly want to consult a prophet of the Lord. In fact, the only one he says there is in his nation still exists is yet one man whom we may inquire of the Lord, Micaiah, son of Amiah. But I hate him, Ahab said, because he never prophesies good concerning me, but always evil. Well, Jehoshaphat says, let not the king say that. Amazing. What a rebuke. Pretty wimpy. The prophet of the Lord is not called to support the king or give good news to the king, but to speak the truth of God. And Ahab does not like to hear the truth. He wants his 400 prophets who say everything he wants them to say. But after Micaiah is persuaded to speak the truth, the prophet says, I saw all of Israel scattered on the mountains as sheep that have no shepherd. Now there's a phrase we'll hear again and again, as sheep who have no shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master. Let each return to his home in peace. Here the prophecy depicts the death of Ahab, the final victory won by God and prophesied by the prophet Elijah. There will be a future, however, in this prophecy where Judah will have no shepherd, where they will be as sheep without a shepherd. And we'll see a lot of that when we study scriptures further, what it's like to be without a shepherd or a leader. Jehoshaphat didn't die in this battle, though. He lived, he returned home. He was condemned upon his return by the prophet for making alliances with Ahab, unless we think that it wasn't clear to both God and then to Jehoshaphat where he had failed. But even though he did many admirable things and God used him, even at the very end of his life, the last thing we hear about Jehoshaphat is the alliance that he makes with the northern kingdom to build a fleet of trading ships, a fleet which sank in the harbor. God's judgment. So we meet a king who's not unlike us, even though he has a very funny name, and none of us are probably going to name our next born children Jehoshaphat. I know I'm not. The key to his success, though, was the times he followed God closely in humility. The keys to his failure were the times that he went out on his own. He lost his humility and he made alliances with others who did not follow the Lord. Let's learn from that, ladies. Let's learn from that today. And let's go forward completely sold out to the Lord God. I hope you have a marvelous discussion, and I love you and I miss you. I look forward to being with you later. Bye-bye.